Charles Cheval.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to just begin by agreeing with something the Minister said, and that is that the process by which parliamentarians have sought to make this a better bill is to be commended by, I think, the committee at this point. In my second reading speech, I recounted the history of this measure, and I think nobody could dispute the proposition that the exhaustive attention that the Justice and Electoral Committee, chaired by Chester Borrows at the time, with the Labour team led by my colleague David Parker, paid to this bill. They really did take their parliamentary duties very seriously in trying to fashion a better measure. So I think what the Minister says in that regard is correct. This bill has had a long gestation period. We can see from the amendments to Part 1 of the bill that the Select Committee didn't simply take a once-over-likely approach. It did look long and hard at how it could make a better bill. I think one of the best examples of that is the purpose clause that the Select Committee inserted, new clause 4A, where the committee clearly thought it needed to provide some guidance to the courts. Members will know that courts look increasingly at purpose clauses when Parliament inserts them for guidance about how the rest of the Act should be construed. And the purpose clause here is instructive. It speaks about modernising the law of search, seizure and surveillance to take into account advances in technologies and to regulate the use of those technologies. And I think the next paragraph is the most important paragraph, providing rules that recognise the importance of the rights and entitlements affirmed in other enactments, including the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990, the Privacy Act 1993 and the Evidence Act 2006. And lastly, to ensure investigative tools are effective and adequate for law enforcement needs. Now, the primary importance of this purpose clause, as I've noted, is at paragraph B, because the specific freedoms that are affirmed by the Bill of Rights, the Privacy Act and the Evidence Act are repeated in the purpose clause. The courts are clearly to have regard to these freedoms when construing the rest of the legislation, and this really is of cardinal importance. The Minister, in her introductory remarks, mentioned that this is a Law Commission prompted attempt to bring into line the search and surveillance powers of the state that are currently scattered across nearly 70 pieces of legislation. 69, I think, was the number that the Minister mentioned. And if the House reflects for a moment on how difficult it is for enforcement agencies, let alone the courts, let alone any other participant in the system, to know just what search and surveillance powers exist in respect of any particular act or any particular agency, with that being the status quo, it will become apparent that it is a generally desirable exercise to bring those powers together in one statute. And that's what this legislation will do if it passes. But, sir, there is one omission in the bill, one significant agency that is not brought within the purview of the legislation. And a number of speakers on the Labour side tonight intend to do their best to persuade the committee that that is an omission that ought to be rectified. We will be putting up and tabling supplementary order papers as we go through the debate part by part, where those supplementary order papers relate to parts under discussion. And we will be attempting, sir, to bring into the legislation the Serious Fraud Office. Now, this is a matter that, Mr Chairman,
Charles Chauvel.
this is a matter that I've had some discussions with the Minister about. David Parker has had extensive correspondence with the Minister's predecessor about it. And the reason that it's relevant to the debate in this part, sir, is that David Parker intends, if he hasn't already, to table a supplementary order paper. He tells me he has, which brings in the definition of the Serious Fraud Office and its director to the interpretation provisions of the bill. And my understanding of the reason that the Serious Fraud Office was not originally brought into the bill is that there was a standing order in the previous set of standing orders that provided that if a bill was not amended by the introductory version of a bill, then it was very difficult without, for example, suspension of standing orders or the unanimous leave of the House to deal with that legislation by way of amendment in later stages. Now, sir, that standing order has not been reenacted in the current version of the standing orders, and so what I'm really putting to the Minister in the chair is that given that that was the prime reason for not being able to bring in and standardise this one last great standout of enforcement powers, the powers of the Director of the Serious Fraud Office, standardising them with the 69 other agencies and pieces of legislation that are going to be dealt with by this bill, then it seems that we in the committee stages have a last opportunity to have a look at doing that. And the supplementary order papers that my colleagues and I will table during the course of the debate will seek to do that. And here's why it's important, sir. The Director of the Serious Fraud Office, by Sections 5 and Sections 9 of that Act, has the most extraordinary powers. He can, without a warrant, without the permission of any other official, politically or otherwise appointed, require the production of any document, and he can require any person to come before him and answer questions. Now, these are very, very wide powers. The Minister will tell us later in the debate about her supplementary order paper that's designed to try to overcome some of the concerns we've raised about media freedoms. And the reason why, unfortunately, her supplementary order paper doesn't quite get there is because the powers of the Director remain untrammelled and unfettered. And so what I'm really asking the Minister and the committee to consider in this debate is to use this final opportunity to bring those powers back into the standardisation that we are considering tonight. What the amendments that we'll deal with later, starting with this amendment to the interpretation clause that David Parker has tabled, would do is they would do away with those powers that I've described. They would retain the powers that the Director has currently under Section 6 and Section 9 of the Serious Fraud Office Act 1990 to go to the court and seek by warrant an extensive range of powers that he needs to do his job. We will acknowledge that. And those powers would be then controlled by Part 4 of this bill. In other words, they would be brought into line with all the other enforcement powers that we're conferring on every other agency via every other statute. And that means that the media freedom issue that we've raised, and which is a very serious one, would be comprehensively dealt with pretty much by the amendments put forward by the Minister in Supplementary Order Paper 12, but also they wouldn't be threatened by these standout draconian powers that would be left with the Serious Fraud Office if we don't deal with it in the way that I've suggested. And it's appropriate in concluding my plea to the committee to have a good think about this, just to remind ourselves that the only reason that the Serious Fraud Office isn't in the legislation, apart from the standing orders accident that I referred to earlier, is that it was a proposal by the last Labor government to merge the Serious Fraud Office and the police. And because that proposal, as I understand it, was on foot when the Law Commission considered this issue, it didn't deal with the powers of the Director. Well, that's an historical anomaly, sir. It's one that we have the chance to rectify, and if we do, it'll go a long way to meeting our concerns.
Dr. Cam Calder.
Mr. Chair, it's a pleasure to rise and take a brief